Let's get more on this now with David Dunn, who's a professor of international politics at the University of Birmingham. Welcome back to the program, Professor. Tell us, how significant is this EU decision to freeze Russian central bank assets indefinitely, both politically and strategically?
Well, strategically first, Ukraine is running out of money. They need $100 billion to survive economically next year. And this is the way to provide that, given that Washington has, under the Trump administration, has stopped funding Ukraine. It's easy for the Europeans to do this and to borrow more money themselves on the markets or to raise taxes to do it. So these frozen assets in Belgium are the easiest and obvious way of creating a fund to leverage against, as collateral to leverage against, to actually raise money to give to Ukraine. It's a significant move in that, as the Belgian Prime Minister said, the European states are not at war with Russia. But the argument goes, okay, well, what are you going to do with the money? You're not going to give them the money back to Russia. You're not going to give them money back to Russia when the war stops, given that they were the aggressor and they have effectively destroyed most of Ukraine, and Ukraine needs to be rebuilt. So what are you going to do with the assets? Well, what the European Union, the majority of the big states, the majority of all states, in fact, and the European Union see this as an obvious way of using these assets to use them as collateral to create a loan to give to Ukraine to both help it sustain the war, if that's what's necessary for the next year ahead, or to put them in a better bargaining position in the negotiations that are taking place. Because if Russia thinks that Ukraine's going to collapse, they're not going to make concessions in the talks. If Ukraine has the backing of this loan, then they're in a better position to resist the demands of the Russians for even more territory and for the destruction, effectively, of Russian sovereignty. But it is a big move in terms of actually this hasn't been done before, but many aspects of this conflict are unprecedented, and this is one of those.
The EU wants to use these frozen assets to finance a major loan to Ukraine. Does this cross a legal red line, or do you think the EU is confident that it's found a workable workaround?
Well, the EU thinks that there are no courts that would enforce this that Russia is a part of, and they think it more than a bit rich, or more than a bit ironic that at the time when Russia is illegally bombing courts and banks, it wants to use courts to enforce banks to do things using legal mechanisms. So they're not really worried about whether the Russians will succeed in the legal aspect of that, but they're worried about the attempt of Russia to make an issue of this in third-party countries, or to put off other countries for putting their assets into European banks, particularly Belgian banks, for fear that actually those assets could be sequestered in the future. So it's about reputation rather than the legality. But it's also an attempt by the Russians to try and put pressure on the Europeans, given the fact that the Russians rather cleverly in their diplomacy have suggested to the Trump administration that actually those assets could be used to create profits for Washington in any future Russian-American projects in Ukraine or elsewhere. So the Russians are trying to use this as a diplomatic leverage as much as they are trying to get a legal result.
Okay, Professor David Dunn, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us on the program.
Always a pleasure.